For the sake of time, I start the panel right now. Thank you very much for joining this morning for this conference. So our session has been renamed Nuclear Economics. There has been a slight change of the program overnight, so there will be 4 speakers today. The first speaker will be Francois Boisseleau from Engie, who will talk about the Belgium experience of nuclear phase-off and the installation of a capacity remuneration mechanism. Then we will have Yves Le Thieis from Compass Lexecon, who will present the contribution of the French nuclear park to the energy transition in Europe. Then our third speaker will be Guillaume Dezobry, who will talk about the French regulation of nuclear and in particular the ARENH mechanism. And finally, Mr. Toru Hattori, the UK-Japan comparison of nuclear acceptance and in light of the climate change and climate transition. So I'm Bertrand Charmaison. I'm working for CEA in France, and I'm leading the IAEE Institute, which is an institute in charge of the economics and sustainability of energy transition. I'm very glad to be your chairman today. So as there are 4 of you today, I propose to start immediately in order to leave you approximately 25 minutes for each of you for the presentation and Q&A session. I will then start by Francois Boisseleau from Engie. So Francois is Chief Economist in Engie Benelux and is part of Regulatory and Public Affairs Department. Francois also PhD of Paris Dauphine and is expert in the economics of nuclear. So Francois, I'll leave you the floor for approximately 20 minutes of presentation. In case you're late, I will remind you. And thank you very much for starting this panel. Francois, up to you.
Thank you, Bertrand. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes?
Good.
Okay, so good morning to all of you. So indeed, I will talk about nuclear in Belgium and let's say the phase-out law of nuclear that was voted almost 20 years ago, and the setup of a capacity mechanism, which is a key element replacing nuclear capacity in Belgium. So just to give you an order of magnitude of nuclear in Belgium. So basically we have 2 main sites in the north and the south of the country. They represent in total something like 6 gigawatts of installed capacity. And we have all the assets are supposed to be closed after 40 years following the 2003 law. And as you can already see from this slide, the 3 oldest assets will be around for 50 years because they have been extended already, and I will explain you how it happened. So just to try to give, to make a long story short about nuclear in Belgium. So the nuclear power plants were built in the 70s and the 80s. If you look at the electricity production we do have in Belgium since 30 years, just to show you, let's say, the importance of nuclear. So it represents between, let's say, 50%, 60% at the beginning, and less than 40% the year where nuclear was not so much available. Until 2018-19, nuclear was really quite significant in terms of share. And as of next year, actually 22, we will start closing nuclear power plant. And by 25, we will not have any more nuclear in Belgium. And this nuclear is supposed to be replaced by renewables. So we have significant investment in renewables which are planned, and by gas power plants that will represent more or less 50% by 2030 and 50% covered by renewables. On top of that, Belgium is a very interconnected country, so we have quite some significant level of import. So if you look at the history, so in 2003, the law was voted to close nuclear in Belgium by 2015 and 2025. In 2012 and in 2015, we realized that we had an issue with security of supply. So the government decided to extend the oldest units that were extended until 2022 and 2025. In 2019, it was decided to put a CRM in place, so capacity remuneration mechanism, to ensure investment for security of supply in Belgium. Hence, by 22, so next year we'll start with the phase out of the first unit, and it will end by 25, where we will have the last unit being closed. But still, in the law, it was planned like this already in 2003. That's why we extended some units. It is possible to extend a nuclear power plant if there is an issue with security of supply. So that's the reason why Belgium has extended already 3 units. And in the current coalition agreement of the government, there is also the possibility, after the CRM auctions that will take place by October this year, there is a possibility to review this for the 2 most recent nuclear units, which is quite an issue because actually the nuclear operator mentions that November will be too late to extend the 2 latest units, because in nuclear, you know, it takes quite some time to prepare a lifetime extension from a technical perspective, but not only, but also from a legal perspective with different consultations that are needed and different legal agreements, especially you have to make a new law. This takes quite some time. So as of today, we can say that Belgium is exiting nuclear. October next year will be the closure of the first unit. In 23, the second one, and then by 25, you see that all units will disappear. So that's something very specific to Belgium, where nuclear is quite significant, about 50% of electricity generation, and we will be exiting nuclear in a time frame of 3 years. So that's quite a challenge for the country to ensure security of supply. So just to go back very quickly on the law, in 2003, it was decided by the government to phase out nuclear, so to limit the operating lifetime of all units by 40 years. However, as I already mentioned, if there were an issue of security of supply, the government could decide to extend or to, let's say, temporarily make derogation to the law. Maybe one question that people often ask: why did the government decided to phase out nuclear in 2003? If you look at the memorandum that was attached to the law, there were no clear economic, ecological, or technical reason. The key reasons that were mentioned during the hearings, where the Secretary of State, which was in charge of energy, mentioned that Belgium should exit nuclear because of the risk of nuclear accident, the risk of weapon proliferation, and waste management. I will not enter into the details of pro and anti-nuclear, because otherwise we can take the full day on this topic. However, you can imagine this was heavily contested in 2003 by the advocate of nuclear, and of course it's still, let's say, heavily challenged by people in favor of nuclear. So we had some derogation to ensure security of supply. And one of the key elements from my perspective is that in the 2003 law, there were no clear plan on how Belgium will exit nuclear. So it was, the ambition was to exit nuclear, but what would replace nuclear was not defined. How it would happen was not defined. So the assumption was, to some extent, nuclear will be phased out and the market will take care of it. Investment will take place in other type of technologies. In the law, you could see that renewables should play a role, that energy efficiency should play a role, and gas was already mentioned as a key technology to replace nuclear. And finally, you can think of interconnection and import that was considered as an important element to replace nuclear in Belgium. So as I mentioned, 2012 and 2015, we had the first lifetime extension of the 3 oldest units. So ironically, Belgium will have the 3 units that will run 50 years, which are the oldest one. And in 21, we'll see what happened in November. It's quite difficult in practice to think of a lifetime extension, but it's in the government coalition agreement, so it could happen. So Belgium decided to go for CRM. Again, like for a nuclear debate, I will not go into the details of all type of CRM because that's already quite a complex topic. But if you think of a CRM taxonomy, you have volume-based and price-based CRM. Belgium decided to go to a volume-based CRM to replace those 6 gigawatts of nuclear. Belgium decided to define a volume of capacity that is needed at peak. And it's a market-wide mechanism, meaning that it covers all assets in Belgium able to deliver capacity are eligible to the CRM. And amongst these different type of CRMs are capacity obligation, capacity option. Belgium decided to go for reliability option, which is quite a complex mechanism. So if you think of reliability options, so they are volume-based, they are market-wide, meaning all assets are eligible. They go for megawatts, they are technology neutral, so any type of capacity can contribute. So it does not matter if you are gas, renewable, storage, whatever, you are eligible, you can participate to the CRM. You might have, of course, some derating factors, some technical constraints to consider your specificity, but all technology can join. It's a centralized system in the sense that the TSO with authorities define how much should be auction, and it's decided at a governmental level. And you then have an auction, which is a competitive process where all bidders offer their capacity. And one element which is specific to a reliability option is that you have, as you can see in the name, it's an option. So you have a strike price and you have a payback obligation, meaning that if the price in the market is too high, you have to pay some money. The idea of a capacity market is to replace some price spike, which are difficult to anticipate, by a fixed payment. What you want to avoid here as a policymaker is that you get first a fixed payment, and on top you benefit from price spike. So if there are price spike, you want capacity provider to pay you back some money because they receive it in advance. You can think of it like an insurance premium. You pay for an insurance, so when the accident, let's call the price spike an accident, when the accident arrive, then you are insured as a customer. The mechanism is quite heavy. It's several hundred of pages of rules and regulation. I would just discuss 2-3 elements of it that can take, I mean, each element you can spend an hour on it. So you have a couple of parameters on the auction. So the strike price, at how much do you have to pay back? You have the intermediate price cap, which is a cap which the bidder have to follow, and I will come back to that point. You have to define a reference price. So which price do you use? Because it's, I mean, in electricity market, you have plenty of prices. You have the day rate prices, you have the forward prices, you have the imbalance prices. So on which price do you have to pay back? You have to consider derating. As you know, a PV panel, a wind farm, gas power plants, they cannot all deliver technically the same guaranteed power. So you have to consider those technical elements in your capacity mechanism. One element is the input for your demand curve. How much capacity do you want to contract? And so to some extent, you have to create a demand curve. I will come back to it. Then you have qualification process where assets in advance have to qualify to participate to the auction. Then you have your auction, and you have different type of format of auction, and Belgium decided to go for pay-as-bid auction, which is quite unique in Europe. You have cross-border participation, which is extremely important in any CRM and extremely important in Belgium because Belgium is interconnected with France, with Germany, with the Netherlands, and with the UK. So you have a lot of interconnection with very big countries from a power perspective in Europe. Then between the auction and the delivery, you have the monitoring. So the auction takes place 4 years in advance and 1 year in advance. So at the end of this year, in a few months from now, you will have the auction for 24. And between now and 24, you will have some investment and they will be monitored. And then when you are in the delivery year, you get some money for the capacity you manage to get qualified and that won a capacity contract in the auction. You have to pay back if the price go be above the strike price, and you also have to monitor what all available are the different players. And finally, you have a secondary market where you can make some adjustment. So one key element is, of course, how much capacity do you want to contract in your CRM, and the clean energy package, which is a quite heavy but rather comprehensive package. You have a lot of rules on how you define the capacity, and you have for policymaker a balance to find between too much capacity and too little capacity. If you go for too much, you are going to pay a lot for capacity, for some capacity which is not needed. So it's quite a high societal cost for customers, and you also end up with depressed energy price because you have too much capacity. On the other hand, if you have too little capacity, then you have no adequacy. It's not insured, which is a bit bad because you are paying for some insurance, but since you are not contracting enough, you are not fully insured. And of course, you end up with high energy prices and potentially some load shedding because you don't have enough capacity to cover your peak. For the volume, you have to define a demand curve. I will not go into the detail of it, but basically you have all the assets here as a supply on the supply side that can provide capacity. And as policymaker, you have to define your famous point B, which is the level of capacity you want to have. So you have to define the volume associated to it. So in Belgium, we have discussion around 13 gigawatt of peak demand. So that's more or less where your point B should be. And then you can put some elasticity and you are willing to contract a bit less if it's too expensive. And you could potentially, theoretically, contract a bit more. And on top of the volume element, you have to define the price you associate to those elements. So in practice, when you look at the capacity, how it will be covered by some cross-border capacity. It will be covered by, there is a specific rule in Belgium. I explain it in the paper, but I will not go into the details here in the presentation, where you have some capacity you have to contract in T-1 that will be needed for less than 200 hours. You have all existing capacities that can, of course, participate. I mean, in Belgium, you have 50% of nuclear, but you have 50% of capacities that will still be around, so that can contribute. You have other assets which are, for instance, non-eligible, like cogeneration, CHP, PV, winds that are subsidized. If they are not subsidized, they can participate to the CRM. And then you have new capacity. And the question is how much capacity is needed to replace those 6 gigawatts. A couple of studies have been done in Belgium. Some people argue that we need 3.9 gigawatts. Some people argue that we need 2 gigawatts. There will be some still fine tuning to be done. And we will see after the auction how much capacity has been contracted. So one element which is important from a political perspective in Belgium is to keep the cost of the capacity mechanism under control. And there are a lot of elements of the design that try to address this element. So you have this payback obligation, meaning that if the market prices are going too high, then capacity provider have to pay back. You also have the pay as bid auction mechanism. So that's the idea to keep the cost as low as possible because you pay people the money they bid, not the marginal price. I will come back to that in a minute. You also have an intermediate price cap for existing capacity, meaning that existing capacity cannot bid above a certain price, which is quite unique to combine in a CRM, a pay as bid and intermediate price cap. And you do have the 200 hours rule, which aim to limit the level of investment. So just on the pay as bid, it's well known in the academic literature that if you put in place a pay as bid mechanism, there is only one thing that is sure, that people will not bid in the same way. This is well known since, I would say, at least 20 years. But still, it was decided that it would be cheaper in Belgium because it is assumed to some extent that people will be exactly the same, so the cost for society will be lower. When you look at any auction, you have an auction in T-4 and auction in T-1. The T-4 auction is here to facilitate investment because you need 3-4 years to build a new plant. And in T-1, you have an adjustment auction where you try to contract the last capacity, and also for some type of asset, -1 is T-1 is enough. You can think, for instance, of demand side management. So in most CRM in Europe, you have between 1 and 5% of capacity that is auction in T-1. In Belgium, with this 200 hours rule, it's about 25% of capacity. So it's a combination of the 200 hours rule and the cross-border capacity, which is quite significant. And for some people, they argue it's a key risk. And for some other people, they say, no, it's good things. It will facilitate innovation. Here, we don't know. We will have to see what happens actually in 24. The intermediate price cap, this is one element which has been heavily criticized. So the idea again is to limit the cost of the CRM, meaning that you have an existing asset, you have to bid below this intermediate price cap. So you are combining a pay-as-bid and an intermediate price cap. One key issue is that you reduce the competition between old asset and new asset, because new asset in a CRM try also to compete with old asset, especially via a long-term contract. In this case, they cannot really compete because you are squeezing a lot the existing asset. You create little incentive to offer below the intermediate price cap. And if it's too low, and that's the key issue, if it's too low, you have you may create an exit for some asset because they simply cannot stay around, while they could be cheaper than other assets. And the other way around, if it's too high, it is quite useless because you are putting a cap which is too light. We'll see how it is considered by the DG Comp, because Europe has to approve this CRM. And also in line with the state aid guideline, it remains to be seen whether this is acceptable, because it creates, let's say, an element that impact investment decisions that were made before the CRM. So Belgium proposed a derogation mechanism, and it's quite a challenging exercise because the regulator will have to define whether people asking for derogation can justify it based on their missing money. So their missing money is the money they are not getting into the normal energy market, and they want to get from the CRM. So if they don't get it, if they argue that they need a certain amount of money, but this amount of money is above the intermediate price cap, they will have to justify it. But it's quite impossible task for the regulator, because it will have to assume how much money a player will get in the years to come into the energy-only market. And we know that the energy-only market is quite volatile, so it will be a battle of assumption. And at the end, you could argue that if you are able to compute the missing money of everyone, why do you put a market in the first place? You could simply regulate and give to each asset a predefined amount of money, and you don't need to run into this type of complex mechanism. So just to conclude here, it's quite a challenging timeline. Initially, the European approval was expected for June 2020, so 1 year ago. We still do not have this approval, so we hope to get this approval during the summertime, and the auction is by the end of September, October. So that will be quite a tight timing to have this CRM in place and have enough capacity available by 25. I will not go into the detail of this, just to close here. So some early lesson, even if we are still before the first auction. So I would argue that when you plan a phase out of nuclear, you need a comprehensive plan with some real elements with, let's say, the capacity you want to use to replace nuclear, some timing. If you plan a mechanism such as a CRM, you need to plan it quite in advance. So in 2003, we had quite some time, but we realized in Belgium, we started, even if the discussion around the CRM started in 2015, 2016, the first law was in 2019. So you have less than 2 years to put in place a CRM. That's quite short when you see all the discussion. Ideally, you want your CRM to be as competitive as possible and transparent. Here, in the case of Belgium, we have a lot of rules to control, to some extent, the competition. The question is whether it will really control the competition or will hamper the competition. I did not discuss it so much, but of course, compared to 2003, we have a real ambition in Belgium in terms of decarbonization, and of course, building gas asset in 2021 is quite challenging if you want to achieve CO2 reduction by 2050. We'll see after the first auction. We should monitor very carefully the result, and we'll see how the law will be changed. So in terms of next steps, so you can have two extreme basic scenario, a very optimistic one where the DG Comp will approve the CRM on time during the summertime, where player will be able to compete on a level playing field and have sufficient capacity at the lowest cost, which is the ambition, and keep the CO2 emission under control. There are some, for instance, some rules around CO2 emissions that are planned in the CRM. A more pessimistic scenario is a mechanism that would not be approved or with a delayed approval. The nuclear option could be reopened in 21, so we have to see what could be done, because as I mentioned, it was announced that it would be difficult to extend nuclear in November. And you can also think of player bringing to court some legal action against the CRM, because we have seen it in the UK or in Poland. If the rules are not well defined and not approved, or even if they are approved by DG Comp, some player can really challenge them. And then we have a risk of security of supply by 2025. And this is where we don't want to end up in 25 in Belgium. That's it for me. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much, Francois, for your comprehensive presentation. I think we have two questions in the chat. The first question from Guillaume. So as regards the French CRM mechanism, the Commission considered that 4 years was not enough to encourage new investment and asked to have long-term auctions, 7 years. Do you think the same problem may arise for Belgium?
So you have to think. One is timing. So 4 years in advance for building capacity. This is quite standard in most CRM. So I mean, if you think of the asset we can build, I mean, nuclear power plants are not built in the context of CRM. So the main asset are gas plants. So 4 years is quite reasonable. One other element is, of course, a long-term contract you can have in a CRM. So in a CRM, you have contract that can be 10 years. In Belgium, we decided to have 15 years, 8 years, 3 years, and 1 year. So 4 years, there have not been we did not have any challenge on this so far, but it could happen. I don't know what you want or what you can build if you have an auction 7 years in advance.
Okay, another question from Rodica. Maybe I start by the second question. What is supposed to replace the 6 gigawatt of nuclear? What is the technology that will most likely contribute? So,
I mean, what is expected is that renewable will play a role. So, for instance, Belgium is one of the leading countries in terms of wind offshore. So, wind offshore in Belgium will contribute. Of course, you still have intermittency with wind, so you have to derate it. We also expect PV to play an important role in Belgium in general. Not so much for adequacy, because peak demand is in winter time in the evening, so PV contribution is quite limited, but it's not zero. We expect interconnection, so that's one debate about importing electricity from neighboring countries. And on top of that, of course, a gas power plant. And you can, the two other important contributors that are expected, and we'll see whether they manage to be competitive in the auction, are demand side management and batteries. So we have to see all those contributions. There are some assumptions, and again, it's a battle of assumption. By 25, what will be able to compete? We have to see. Let's say the first answer will be the October auction, where we will see the different contributors.
Okay, and the second question was there any model for computing the inframarginal rent, or I do assume it's a result of the auction process, actually, that people will calculate the rent they expect and they will bid as in accordance.
So there are two things. First, the TSO is computing as a model of electricity, of the electricity market, and is using it for different purposes. One, of course, is the adequacy issue, to see whether we have an issue or not. And it is also used to compute the missing money of the asset. And here, of course, it has been quite challenged by different parties because you have to make assumptions. So if the TSO, for instance, assume that the CO2 price is 50, and if a market party assumes that the CO2 price is 70 or 22, you change one parameter, it has an impact on the inframarginal rent. So, I mean, the TSO, like market parties, don't have a crystal ball. So those assumptions are quite different. Then each market party will make its own assumption on the inframarginal rent. So I work for one of the operator, but my competitor will also make their homework, and they will assume the evolution of gas price, of CO2 price, of capacity in France, in Germany, and so on and so forth. And we will all compute our, let's say, missing money and bid into the CRM. And the most, let's say, aggressive one are likely to win, and the most conservative one are likely to go home without any contract in the CRM. But that's just part of the competitive process.
Okay, thank you very much, Francois, for your presentation. We will now move to the second panelist of today. So it's Yves Le Thieis from Compass Lexecon. Yves Le Thieis is senior economist in Compass Lexecon in Paris. He's in charge of modeling energy markets. Yves graduated from École Polytechnique and holds a master from London School of Economics. And today, Yves will present a study made by Compass Lexecon on the contribution of the French nuclear park to the energy transition in Europe. Thank you, Yves. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Can you see my screen? Can you see me? Yeah, good.
It's okay.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. So first of all, apologies for the non-French speakers participants. The slides are in French, but I will do the presentation in English. So given the short time slot, let's dive into the presentation of the analysis. And before looking at the results, let's remind us a bit of the current and new decarbonization objective at the EU level and the likely implication on the power system. So we see three main implications, three main categories with a lot of different variants within each categories. So first of all, so increasing the decarbonization objective will have a significant impact on the power demand side, especially as electricity is called to play a bigger role in decarbonizing the European economy. And so through electrification of new end usages like transport, heating, as well as industry, electricity demand is effectively likely to significantly increase by 2050. On the supply side, obviously, decarbonizing would mean to increase low carbon energy development and decrease as well all of the carbon intensive technologies, which are more or less already enacted through the different coal phase out plans. And last but not least, to make sure that the system remains reliable through to 2050, decarbonizing and increasing the penetration of variable renewable energy would have a significant impact on the networks, the need and the usage of the transmission capacity between the different bidding zones and within the countries as well as the significant increasing need of flexibility. So flexibility through development of short-term storages, long-term storages, as well as embedded flexibility from the demand side. So I just have a couple of examples on the next set of slides, just illustrating by how much the power system would have to change effectively along the line of these carbon neutral objective. So first, demand, power demand is effectively called to increase from, say, current level is around 3,000 terawatt-hours, and most of the EU scenarios looking at full decarbonization by 2050 would effectively show demand increasing to above 5,000 terawatt-hours, so quite a significant increase to 2030. Second, so we say that effectively power side would have to change, and so alongside the increase of variable renewable, carbon intensive capacities would have to close as well before 2050, and actually in the next decade. And so we can see that so all of the installed coal capacities, so coal and black coal and brown coal capacities, so reaching about 120 gigawatts at the moment across Europe. Most of them, 110 gigawatts, would be closed by 2040 already. So quite a reduction of controllable and somehow reliable capacity as well to ensure security of supply. And so last but not least as well, so to drive the decarbonization, there will be a significant increasing need of flexibility. So flexibility from effectively new type of storages through short-term batteries, knowing that short-term storage would effectively already be batteries that last for a couple of hours, so more than the batteries that are currently used for ancillary services, as well as more longer-term storages, which are currently satisfied by hydro dams, for instance. And so we see that the system would effectively need to rely on more seasonal storage in some ways, increasing demand-side flexibility through dynamic demand charging, for instance, for electric vehicle, or dynamic utilization of heating, or direct or indirect electrification of the industry. And a bigger role as well of the network through increasing transmission, as well as increasing within intra-regional or intranational transmission capacity, network capacity, to make sure that all of these additional variable renewable are connected to the system and correctly integrated into the power system. So when we set the kind of the picture and the likely evolution of the power system, so what we wanted to analyze through the study that we conducted for that sense, which is the French Energy Nuclear Organization. So we wanted to assess the role of the French nuclear fleet, so alongside the decarbonization objective, and accounting for the key uncertainties that kind of arise from the key change of the power system that we just outlined. So basically, the carbon neutrality objective by 2050 would rely on 3 pillars: a significant decrease of power demand, a significant reduction of controllable capacity, and a significant increase of variable renewable. And all of these 3 pillars would come with a range of technical and economic uncertainties. So around obviously the cost reduction outlook of these different technologies. So both for renewable, but mainly for all of the flexibility technologies, so short-term or long-term storages, as well as uncertainties around the evolution of the nuclear capacity, so both in France and across Europe. So basically, to assess the role of nuclear, accounting for these different, accounting for the overall or global carbon neutrality objective at the EU level, as well as the uncertainty around the evolution of the different technologies. So we assessed basically 4 scenarios, and we looked at the contribution of nuclear within these 4 scenarios. So just to remind us, the capacities that would be assessed in terms of nuclear capacities, so both in France and Europe. So we are not assessing extreme scenarios in terms of nuclear capacity evolution in France, as well as the EU. But we assess scenarios that are currently analyzed, so within the RT 2050 energy roadmap, which were as well disclosed by the European Commission in the previous 2050 energy roadmap, which would obviously be updated in July once the new roadmap is published. So for the French nuclear fleet, it translates into 2 scenarios. So one assuming no new capacities, but an extension of the existing fleet to 60 years, and so reaching 15 gigawatts, sorry, by 2050. So basically, so it's smoothing the evolution and the reduction of nuclear capacity, with a bunch of reactors being extended to 60 years and others being only extended to 50 years. So to basically make sure that you don't end up having to close 10 or more gigawatts of nuclear capacity in 1 year, so that the system remains secure at all times. And in the high scenario, we assume 37 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2050. So basically assuming 22 gigawatts of new capacity by 2050. So which basically assume a twin EPR every 4 years after every 2 years, sorry, after 2035. So which was assumed by the CEN that it would be kind of the minimum or optimal nuclear development path to sustain an efficient nuclear industry in France. At the EU level, so we assume that nuclear capacity would evolve towards 110 gigawatts in the high scenario. So basically assuming that a number of other countries would effectively phase out or would redevelop some nuclear capacity, so mainly in Eastern Europe. So just a brief word on the modeling platform. So to assess basically these 4 scenarios, and so to assess the distinct capacity evolution, generation outlook, and also prices differences as well within these 4 scenarios. So we use our capacity expansion pan-European dispatch model, so that capacities would be endogenously calculated by the model under a set of constraints. So basically meeting demand, obviously, ensuring security of supply, as well as decarbonizing the power system. So both at the EU level and at the French level. So I wanted to, so given the time allocated, I wanted to present 2 sets of key findings. So one on the capacity and generation impact, and second on the wholesale price evolution. So first of all, so before analyzing and comparing the different scenarios, so first thing to notice is that across all of the 4 scenarios that we tested, there would be a necessary continuous and increased variable renewable energy development. So increased because after 2030, after reaching the current national energy climate plans objective, the annual rate of variable renewable energy would have to increase to fully decarbonize by 2050. And alongside the development of viable renewable across all scenarios as well, so there would be a significant need of new flexible sources. So mainly basically to effectively replace the decreasing controllable capacity from the thermal fleet, but as well to meet the increasing demand despite the development of embedded flexibility. Now, comparing the 2 set of nuclear scenarios, so we see that so maintaining and redeveloping to some extent the French nuclear fleet would allow to effectively maintain a 30 to 35% low carbon nuclear energy share by 2050, so below the 50% objective in 2035, and so reaching only 30% by 2050. And so that's in the context of an increasing demand, and would allow as well to diversify the mix and basically to play with and to benefit from the complementarity of nuclear with variable renewable energy. In a scenario, so without the nuclear option, so without the redevelopment of the French nuclear fleet, well, there would be obviously a significant, an increasing need of developing variable renewable and flexible sources. So assuming that both the decarbonizing objective, the carbon neutrality objective, sorry, and the security of supply objective are met in the same way as with the nuclear option scenario, within the nuclear option scenario. And second, there would be a significant reduction of net export as well as a negative impact on the commercial balance, simply because the French mix would be more homogeneous with the neighboring mixes, generation mixes, so that effectively you would less benefit from the complementarity between nuclear and variable renewable. Complementarity being, well, mainly transposed or illustrated by the fact that nuclear would both provide seasonal flexibility and short-term flexibility by 2050. So if we just have a quick look at more detailed results. So first, even with the nuclear option, so with the redevelopment of nuclear capacity, we see effectively that most of the renewable capacity would need to significantly increase between 2020 and 2050. So wind reaching nearly the maximum of their potential. So potential being defined by the ADEME and RT in terms of economically achievable potential. And we see that there is a bit of remaining potential from solar capacity. So knowing that solar would be largely developed across the neighboring countries as well, and so would capture low prices compared to the average price. So that's why the model turns out to favor wind generation over solar capacity in the long term. So in terms of development of flexible sources, so we see a significant increase of the requirement of flexibility. So both from the demand side, so which is the light purple, and the supply side as well. So that's in the with a nuclear option scenario, and so between the two different scenarios of flexibility evolution. So we see that if effectively new flexibility sources appears to be less available than in the accessible flexibility scenario, you would effectively more rely on green gas. So not the clean gases or e-gases, but more green gas, rather than developing power to gas to power type of technologies, which would basically produce clean gases or e-gases to effectively balance the power system. And so we see a kind of a combined contribution of different sources. So it's not a winner takes all type of results, but we see that there are a range of flexibility requirements in the long term, which would be met by a range of different technologies, so both short-term and long-term flexibilities technologies. So in terms of generation, so just illustrating what I just mentioned, so from the 75% nuclear share as of today, so we see a reduction of the nuclear generation share to the benefit of effectively increasing all of the variable renewable energy. So knowing that the total demand would effectively significantly increase, would have to significantly increase by 2050. Now, more interesting is to check how the different capacities and duration have evolved between the different scenarios, and so comparing with and without the nuclear option. So we see that nuclear would be effectively replaced. So not developing the nuclear fleet would effectively be replaced or offset by a significantly increasing variable renewable. And so given that the potential for wind is already nearly achieved in the with nuclear scenario. So it would be mainly developing additional PV, which would need to develop additional short-term capacities effectively to ensure the same security of supply criteria. And so we see as well that beyond impacting the French mix, it would effectively impact the neighboring countries as well. So requiring additional variable renewable technologies, as well as additional reliable and flexible sources. So in terms of generation figures, so we see effectively that the non-production of 150 terawatt-hours of nuclear, so between the two scenarios, would be effectively replaced by more variable renewable, which would, I haven't had time to effectively put the more detailed slide on that and describe it, but which would basically be replaced by more variable renewable energy. Basically because in an increased variable renewable energy world, you would effectively have to basically compensate for the losses of the storages, so that you would produce more for the energy to be displaced and used at a different time during the in the year or during the day, so that you ensure the same security of supply. Last but not least, on the generation side, so it's the impact on networks and exports, and effectively reducing the nuclear capacity or not redeveloping the nuclear fleet would have a significant impact on exports. So more than halving the net export balance by 2050, and so reducing the net export balance compared to 2020 level. Now, in the 1 minute left, so if we just quickly touch base on the result on the price and on the economic side of things. So first of all, what we see that across all scenarios, we see a significant decorrelation between thermal cost of production and average world sale prices, and so that's because directly linked with the significant increase of variable renewable energy. And alongside the significant decorrelation of prices, we see a significant increase of volatility as well across all scenarios. And obviously, so the analysis shows that with a higher nuclear or a redevelopment of nuclear capacity in France, we show that these evolution will be slightly reduced in some ways, so slightly compensating for the increased volatility and increased decorrelation between thermal assurances and average price. In terms of, and finally, in terms of total production cost, so it's not the final customer cost, we only look at the production side of things, so not the network related reinvestment. So we see that the nuclear effective option would lead to benefits in terms of total cost of production, so leading to a slightly lower total cost of production by 2050. And so just in 20 seconds, so just showing the decorrelation of prices between thermal assurances and average price, showing the increasing volatility as well between 2020, so that's the low duration curve, so hourly prices, and so showing a significant increase of volatility with a lot of zero prices and a lot of peak prices. And finally, in terms of cost, so we see that effectively cost would increase alongside the decarbonization, but without the nuclear option, cost would further increase than the with nuclear option. Thanks for your attention. Conscious that it's been quite dense, but thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you for taking the challenge, for presenting your study in a very short timing, and also to have replied very shortly due to last minute constraint from Boisseleau and to have joined this panel. So I see two questions. So the first one is: do you expect nuclear power to also provide flexibility, load following operations?
Yes, indeed. Similarly, well, basically in the same way as what the nuclear French nuclear capacity already does in the power system, so providing both short-term flexibility, so having a significant ability to effectively run down or up, well, depending on the generation level. So it's, I think, can provide up to 80% of its capacity in 30 minutes, I think. And so we see that, yeah, most of the, well, all of the existing fleet would be able to provide the same level of flexibility. And all of the new EPRs that would be developed would obviously provide the same level of flexibility. And in terms of optimization or modeling optimization, so we optimize the nuclear utilization in the same way as an hydro stock in some ways, so that effectively nuclear, so the system would assess the value of the remaining fuel or the nuclear energy left available, and so would basically dispatch nuclear energy based on that nuclear value in some ways.
Thank you. And second question about the capacity factor you obtained for nuclear in your model, for new and old nuclear. Is it
So we effectively start with the existing availability and so of the existing fleet. So basically being constrained somehow around 75%. And with the increase of variable renewable penetration, along decarbonization, the capacity factor of nuclear would effectively slightly decrease, but could be maintained around 70% to 2050, and providing more and more flexibility, but with still a high capacity factor.
Okay, thank you very much, Yves. We are right on time to move to our next speaker, with Guillaume Dezobry. Guillaume is a senior lecturer in the University of Amiens. He holds a PhD from Paris in antitrust and regulation regulation law. He specialized in energy law, and his expertise covers all aspects of energy sector. And is, in addition of being a legal expert, Guillaume is also an economic expert, as notably a researcher in the European electricity market share of Paris Dauphine. So thank you very much, Guillaume, for being with us today for your presentation, which relies on the economics of nuclear in France, and in particular, the ARENH mechanism.
Thank you very much, Bertrand, for the introduction, and hello to everyone. I'm mostly a lawyer, I'm not an economist, but I'm trying to understand what's how the regulation in the electric sector can be applied. So a few points of the agenda, but let's jump into the presentation. So you already you must be already very familiar with all these figures, but just to a few moments to remind that the French nuclear fleet at the moment, the historic nuclear, incumbent nuclear, is quite huge because it's almost 60 gigawatts. It's almost 70% of the electricity fed into the French grid. Also important to remind the competitiveness of these assets. 42 euros at full cost, and below 10 euros per megawatt hour on its marginal cost. This is due to the choices made, the political choices made in the 70s, and the Mesmer plan, and the development of the fleet with standardization, unified management, and all of this context that we already know. Most of the assets are already depreciated, and on a political level, the position are not always easy to read, because we have some phase out of certain plants, and we are planning of developing some new assets as well. If we look at it from a regulatory perspective, we have 4 types of assets. We have the one that we are trying to phase out or to close, like Fessenheim, for example. We have the incumbent nuclear fleet that will remain in operation for many years ahead. We have the case of Flamanville, which has been decided in 2007 or 2008, and in a market context, and when EDF decided to invest in Flamanville 3, they did not ask for support mechanism. And we have this future nuclear program that we don't know much about it, but it could be 6 EPR plants, and we'll see what the regulatory framework applicable to this new nuclear will be. The question, the first question that we could ask is how is it possible to open the electric sector to competition in France? So let's step back a little bit and ask ourselves, well, how do we, what are the conditions for creating a certain level playing field between the operators, given the French electricity mix? So this would depend on the political choices, and mainly on two questions. Do we want to preserve the unified management of the nuclear fleet? Meaning, do we want that the incumbent operator remains the only operator of the French fleet? That's the first question. And second question, do we want to preserve the upstream, downstream integration of the incumbent operator? So the first option would be to say no to the first question. So we could cut into several pieces the nuclear fleet and give to some operators one part of this fleet. This would be, from a regulatory perspective, the easiest solution. It would enable new integrated operators to raise, because they would all have more or less the same assets, or the same type of assets, and that would enable competition between them. This competition on the market could allow the nuclear rent to be given back to the consumer, and this will provide an equal treatment between operators, because they would all be in the same position. But on a political side, this was not acceptable. The second option would be to keep the unified management of the nuclear fleet, but to prevent the upstream-downstream integration. This raised some interesting questions that we are now dealing with the Hercule project, where maybe we will have a bit of time to discuss this. This would not allow new integrated operators to raise, because they would not have access to this. They would not have access to the nuclear power, because they would have to go on the wholesale markets to buy it. The sharing of the nuclear rent will not be obtained by this mechanism. So this will be the difficulty of this model, is what if the prices on the wholesale markets are very high and the nuclear producer make huge profits? Do we need, what will be the solution to make sure that the French consumer will benefit from the nuclear fleet? And but it would enable to create a level playing field, because all the suppliers will be on the same level playing field in order to, or as regards access to the nuclear power, because they will all have to buy it from the wholesale markets. But this, a few years ago, this solution was not acceptable either. And we went for option 3. Option 3, meaning that we want to preserve the unified management of the nuclear fleet, and we want to preserve the upstream-downstream integration of the incumbent operator. This solution creates a difficulty in order to allow competition to raise, because this must be accompanied by, or this supposed to put in place a mechanism of access to this to the nuclear resource that in such a context appears as what we call an essential facility or an essential resource. This is what have been done through, this is a kind of conclusion of the Chomsky report, even if the Chomsky report did not go that far and they did not recognize that the nuclear resource would be an essential asset, but it's not that important. The principal conclusion is that in order to allow competition to raise, we need to put in place the ARENH mechanism. What is important to keep in mind is that the ARENH mechanism is the corollary of the choice consisting of maintaining the unified management of the fleet and the upstream-downstream integration of EDF. So as long as those two choices will not be challenged, we will need to think of such a regulatory scheme in order to allow competition. This means that 2025 is not the end of the story for ARENH. It will depend on what will be decided on the political choices. If we keep those two conditions, we will have no choice to continue a mechanism such as the ARENH. Otherwise, we will not have any competition on the market. Well, I don't have time to go into the question of the ceiling, which is a very political question, and not from a regulatory perspective. The ceiling, the 100 terawatt-hour of nuclear resource available for competition is there is no way to explain it. It's just a political bargain, I would say. But one important question that would help us to switch to the other topic is what if prices become very low on the wholesale markets, given the ARENH mechanism, and the question of is the ARENH mechanism a kind of option or a free option? From what we can see is that the nuclear production has been relatively stable during the last years, and meaning that all the suppliers need to have access to nuclear resource in order to sell electricity to their clients. If the prices on the market of the wholesale markets are high, they will go and buy ARENH. If the prices on the wholesale markets are low, or at least are below 42, they will buy their electricity, their nuclear electricity, from the wholesale markets. This, of course, creates a risk for the nuclear producer, because this will not enable the producer to cover the full cost. So we will have to find a way to cover the gap between the wholesale price and the 42 euros per megawatt hour, if we assume that 42 euros covers the full cost of the nuclear. And one of the questions that maybe we will raise at the end of the presentation is who should pay? Is it the French consumer or is it the European consumer? And this raises the question of how is the French fleet a national asset, or does it become a European common good? And of course, this is behind this question is due to the size of the fleet. It probably has been set up that way to export electricity to our neighbors, and this raises a question now we must face with the question of Hercule and the context in which Hercule is coming, because the European Commission, when we read all the packages, and the clean energy package is quite clear on that. The European Commission makes the electricity wholesale markets as a focal point. And of course, this market, economists tell us that this market works with the marginal cost of the marginal plant. And the coverage of fixed cost, or the full cost, will be obtained from the inframarginal rent. However, what we understand is that for low carbon plants, it's much more risky in a way than for other plants, because the gap between the marginal cost and the full cost is very high, and therefore it creates uncertainty that wholesale electricity prices will be high enough to cover the fixed cost. And EDF points out this question, saying that it is quite unlikely that the wholesale electricity prices will fit in a way to cover the fixed cost of low carbon energy producer. And either it will be too low, and this calls into question how we will manage to reward sufficiently the electricity producer, or it will be too high, and this raises the question of the rent and how we can imagine to give it back to French consumer if we assume that, as it has been developed in a time where it was a monopoly, the nuclear rent must be shared between the French consumer or the French citizen. This risk seems to increase in time because of cannibalization of market prices, and depending on the market configuration, the producer is not always encouraged to maximize production capacity, and that what we call modulation of the park, because it can be a question. So in the Hercule discussion, we step back to option 2 in a way, meaning that we are trying to think of a solution, if we understand what the French government is planning to do, that would not allow the upstream downstream integration of the operator. And we are saying that the nuclear producer will sell its production on the market, on the wholesale market, and all suppliers, EDF supplier as well, will have to go on the wholesale market to buy the electricity. This raises many questions, and of course there is a risk that, as we were saying, that the wholesale market price will be too high or will be too low. So to deal with those risks, the French government has proposed to set up a CFD for the whole fleet. So first, if we look back a little bit, we see that the project that we are discussing presently is there is a huge gap between the last decisions. If we look at what happened in the last 15 years, for example, in 2007, EDF decided to invest in Flamanville without any support. So this was a new investment, no support mechanism. In 2013 or 2012, I don't know exactly when the decision was taken to invest in Hinkley Point, EDF says okay to the UK government with a CFD of 35 years which has been decided as investment aid for this new asset. And now we are planning to set up a CFD with no limit of duration for the whole fleet, which is mostly depreciated, because except Flamanville, most of the investment are already depreciated. So the question is that we can ask is what has happened in less than 10 years or almost 12 years maybe to explain this this shift in is the context on the wholesale markets make it compulsory nowadays to set up such an important scheme in order to allow the national producer to open to run the plants. Is the solution proportionate? I think that's one of the discussion with the European Commission at the moment. One important question is that who should be the counterpart in the CFD? And the risk is that if we put the French consumer as a counterpart, the risk is that the French consumer will pay the total cost, the full cost of the nuclear, where the European consumers will pay the marginal cost of the nuclear plant. And one of the question is that if the French consumer pay a higher price than the European consumer, the rest of European consumer, this may be a problem for competitiveness of the French industry, and maybe it's a problem for acceptability of the nuclear as a whole. And if so, can we imagine a European scheme in order to make sure that we can make the most of the nuclear fleet in a way? And I think I will keep it like that because I have already get my 20 minutes. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Indeed, you are right on time. I see questions from Francois. I think it relates back to one of your first slides. Why do you think it was so important to keep the upstream and the downstream together?
I think that when we're trying to understand what was expected from the liberalization of the electric sector in Europe, at first, I think that one of the options was to create the conditions in order for integrated operators to raise and to compete with incumbent operators. And one of the idea, if I understood correctly, was to enable new actors to raise with supplying what they were producing, and of course with a wholesale market. But the wholesale market was not at that time, at least what I understood, the focal point of the liberalization of the market. But now I think that there is a shift in the Commission perspective, and the Commission seems to put the wholesale market at the center of the liberalization process or the competition process, and say if the wholesale market works well, the consumer will benefit from it at the end of the day.
Okay, and the second question of Francois, why it was not acceptable to cut the nuclear fleet into several operators? Also, it relates to your initial slide.
I think it was linked to the social unions, and also because I think that there is two explanations. The first one is it's too sensitive as a technology, and we think that maybe in France nobody else than EDF can run a nuclear plant. And the French Constitutional Council says EDF has a monopoly on the nuclear power plant, and this is a fact. And I don't think that the French government would allow another operator in France to run nuclear plant because probably of security reasons, even though in other countries we can have more than one nuclear operators, but in France I don't think it's possible to imagine. And the second reason is that I don't think that the workers in EDF would accept to change and to become workers of other players on the market. So I think it was not possible to imagine to cut into pieces the nuclear fleet in France. And just one more word, I think in the Chancellor rapport, they point out the fact that such a solution has never been taken anywhere in the world when it comes to nuclear plants.
Okay, maybe a quick question. And in your paper, you explained that that it was necessary to have such mechanism because nuclear was an essential facility, and in particular the fact that competitors of EDF could not access large volumes through the market. But now, as you see that more than 300 or almost 300 terawatt-hours, so almost 70% of the French market is really served by competitive offers. Do you think this could change this premise of the analysis that it is an essential facility?
I think the question is it possible for a supplier to compete with EDF without access to this baseload resource and with a competitive baseload resource? So the question is not, or the question could be put that way: is it possible for a supplier to develop a technology or a means to produce electricity that would be competitive with nuclear, the incumbent nuclear, depreciated nuclear incumbent? And what is very interesting is that when you read the Thomas Léautier book, Imperfect Market and Imperfect Competition, Thomas Léautier says that depreciated assets are essential input when you put it in a context of liberalization. If you open to competition a market, and if you leave all the depreciated assets in the hands of the incumbent operator, there will not be a chance for other competitors to be competitive with it, because the situation will not be the same. There will not be a level playing field. And I think that in France, because you have the hydropower and the nuclear, and altogether it's almost 85% of the electricity fed into the grid, and it's depreciated assets, very competitive assets. If you leave them in the hand of only one operator, there is no chance for the others to compete with them.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Thank you for your presentation. We now move to Toru Hattori from hello, Toru, who is the Deputy Associate Vice President from the Socio-Economic Research Center for Institute of Electric Power Industry in Japan. Thank you very much, Toru, for being with us this morning, or later this afternoon for you today. And you go for a presentation about the public attitudes toward the nuclear power and climate change. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, hello. I'm going to present the result of an international survey on public attitudes toward nuclear power and climate change, conducted last year, 10 years after Fukushima nuclear accident, and in the growing concern about climate change. We picked up the UK and Japan, two countries that still has nuclear power as an option to achieve carbon neutral or net zero target by 2050. The two countries have ambitious CO2 emission reduction target for now, but energy policy formulation in the two countries are different, and so is public attitudes. There is a study that compares the public attitudes toward the nuclear power as well as climate change in the UK and Japan, Portinger et al. 2013. It found several interesting differences and similarities in the public attitudes. This study basically replicates the analysis and updated the results as decarbonization has become a hot issue in both countries. We conducted a web-based online survey for people aged 20 years and older in the UK and Japan during November 24 through to December 2nd in 2020 and collected 2,003,000 adults weighted the sample to make it representative of the UK and Japan respectively. The earlier study actually compiled the results from different surveys to make a comparison, but the survey for this study was conducted at the same time in the two countries with the same set of questions so that we can increase the comparability of the results between the two countries. First, I show the results on concern about climate change. As shown in this figure, a larger proportion of respondents are concerned about climate change, both in the UK and Japan. It is interesting to note that the proportion of respondents in the UK who are not at all concerned is about twice more than that of Japan. Overall, however, there seems to be no big difference in the level of concerns about climate change between the two countries. We also asked several questions on the perception of climate change, and as shown in this figure, the sum of proportions of respondents who agree and slightly agree with each of the statements in the bottom of this figure are very similar. And in fact, that the difference is less than 10% between the two countries. Except for this statement, it is my responsibility to help do something about climate change, where the proportion is higher in the UK by more than 20 percentage points. Related to the difference in the perception of own responsibility with respect to climate change, we looked at the responses to the question asking the necessity of technological development versus behavioral change. In both countries, the proportion of the respondents who think that they need to rely on technological development of cleaner energy sources in addition to changing their behavior, this first statement, is higher than the proportion of respondents who think that they need to rely on technological development because changing the behavior on such a large scale is not feasible. That's the second statement here. It is interesting, however, that the difference in the proportion of respondents who select the first statement and those who select the second statement is much smaller in Japan than in the UK. We do not have a clear understanding about the reason for this difference, but people in Japan may have higher expectation for technological development. We have many results on attitudes toward nuclear power, and I'm going to present the results in this order. First, I will present the results on conditional acceptance of nuclear new build. The condition is that it would help to tackle climate change. About half of respondents in the UK indicate their conditional support, but it is 30 percentage points higher than in Japan, as shown in this figure. The relative difference between the two countries is not much different from the results obtained by earlier studies. So this is the updated part of a survey, taken from a survey. The older results are taken from the earlier studies conducted by other researchers. The difference in public attitudes to nuclear new build would be that framing the nuclear power as a part of the solution to climate change has not been well accepted in Japan. It was pointed out by earlier studies that in the UK, more people tend to accept new nuclear power plants if they are interpreted as a means to tackle the energy policy issues such as climate change and energy security. This figure shows the distribution of shares of different opinions about nuclear power without any statements of the conditions. So we call this unconditional attitudes. We compare the results of the survey in 2013 with our results in 2020. The distribution of opinions in the UK in 2020 is largely unchanged as compared to that of 2013. The share of the respondents who select we should increase the number of nuclear power stations, this first statement, and we should continue using the existing nuclear power station and replace them with new ones when they reach the end of their life, this second statement, together account for less than 40% in the UK. In Japan, it is only slightly less than 20%, and almost the same with the share of conditional acceptance of new nuclear power plants to tackle climate change. Yet another possible reason for the difference in attitude toward nuclear power would be that Japanese public tend to have a higher expectation for alternative means to combat climate change than in the UK. As in the earlier study, we asked whether they agree with the statement we shouldn't think of nuclear power as a solution for climate change before exploring all other energy options, and the results are shown in this figure. The proportion of respondents who strongly agree and tend to agree with the statement became smaller in Japan as compared to the UK by more than 10 percentage points. In the previous studies, it was only slightly lower than in the UK. This result is a bit surprising given the relatively less supportive attitude of the Japanese public towards nuclear power as compared to the UK. It is also interesting to note that in Japan, it was decreased in 2020 as compared to the previous surveys. These questions are a bit tricky and might be a bit confusing to respondents, particularly with an online survey, so care must be taken. We also ask whether they agree with the statement, reducing energy use through lifestyle changes and energy efficiency is a better way of tackling climate change than nuclear power. The proportion of respondents who strongly agree and tend to agree with the statement was a bit smaller in Japan as compared to the UK. Compared to the results from the previous surveys, those proportions are decreased in both countries. It might be because people were forced to stay home longer during the period of survey in 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic and might have thought it's harder to reduce energy consumption at their home. We then asked the perception of nuclear power in the energy mix. As shown in the upper figure, the proportions of respondents who agree and slightly agree with the statement that UK or Japan needs a mix of energy sources to ensure reliable supply of electricity, including nuclear power and renewable energy sources, is also higher in the UK than in Japan by more than 10 percentage points. In Japan, these proportions are higher as compared to that of conditional acceptance of new nuclear power plants, and the difference between the two countries is smaller as compared to the results of the conditional support for new nuclear power plants. The benefit of having nuclear in the energy mix may be affected by the perception of relative cost of renewable energy sources over nuclear power generation. It is particularly important that the countries as both countries witnessed a rapid decrease in cost of renewable energy sources in recent years. The lower figure shows a distribution of respondents who agree or disagree with the statement that the cost of renewable energy is becoming cheaper than nuclear power. Somewhat a larger proportion of people in the UK thought that the renewable energy has a cost advantage over nuclear power. It is interesting that more people in Japan still think that nuclear and renewable energy has higher cost than nuclear. This perception of relative cost may be contributing to accepting the existing nuclear power in energy mix. It is possibly the case that the perception of the potential benefit of nuclear power as a part of the solution to climate change is lower in Japan than in the UK. We asked the questions regarding the perception of potential benefits of nuclear power as a reliable source of energy and affordable energy, as well as helping combat climate change. Public perception of benefits of nuclear power is generally higher in the UK as compared to Japan. As shown in the figure, however, relatively smaller proportion of respondents agree with the statement that nuclear power generation will help combat climate change. This indicates that in the UK, at least for some fraction of the respondents who indicated conditional acceptance of new nuclear power plants, the nuclear power was not actually considered to help combat climate change, because about 50% conditionally accept new nuclear new build. But this figure shows only 30% believe that it would help combat climate change. We also asked the perception of risks of nuclear power. The proportion of respondents who are very concerned about various risks of nuclear power plants are generally higher in Japan than in the UK, as shown in this figure. The difference is higher for the risk of accident and natural disaster to cause accident. This is not surprising, as Japan had experienced the Fukushima nuclear accident triggered by tsunami about 10 years ago. Moreover, the level of confidence in government regulation of nuclear power seems to be higher in the UK as compared to Japan. As compared to the results of survey in 2013, the proportion of respondents who agree with the statement that their government adequately regulate nuclear power is almost the same in each country as shown in the upper figure, and it's much lower in Japan. Okay, so to wrap up, we confirm that as indicated by earlier studies, about 50% of respondents in the UK support building new nuclear power plants if those plants help tackling climate change or improve energy security, and that these proportions have been rather stable. In Japan, although slightly increased from the previous surveys, only about 20% of respondents support building new nuclear power plants with the same condition on climate change. And the proportion is the same as those who indicate unconditional acceptance toward new nuclear power plants. The level of concern about climate change among the Japanese people is not necessarily lower than those of the UK. However, the proportion of the respondents in Japan who prefer alternative means other than nuclear power in order to tackle climate change is lower than those in the UK. Related to this, the respondents in Japan are less willing to change their lifestyle to tackle climate change than those in the UK. In addition, the proportion of respondents in Japan who recognize their own responsibility to help do something about climate change is also lower than in the UK. We also found that the level of trust in government regulation of nuclear power among the Japanese people is lower than those of the UK. It is important to reassure people in Japan by showing that the new nuclear power plants are to be adequately regulated with respect to safety. Although both the UK and Japan have an option to rely on nuclear power to achieve the net zero emission or carbon neutral target, the results of a survey suggested that the issues need to be addressed to obtain conditional support for nuclear power as climate change measures would be different. in two countries. Our results suggest that there might be some other conditions for people in Japan that would lead them to accept new nuclear power plants. Perhaps, for example, people in Japan may be reluctantly accept new nuclear power plants if they think those plants help tackling climate change without changing their lifestyle. There are many points to be addressed in the future research. Future research needs to investigate the effectiveness of reframing nuclear power as means to combat climate change or to achieve net zero emission target. We need to analyze determinants of public attitudes in the UK and Japan toward nuclear power and climate change to figure out under what situation people are likely to conditionally accept new nuclear power plants. It would be interesting to examine whether applicability of the notion of conditional acceptance is restricted to a specific country or not. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toru, for your presentation, and thank you for coming to this session at the last minute too. I see there is a question for you in the chat.
Yes.
Do you think that the answer that you raised would be pretty the same if the question would be to choose between nuclear and technology with high CO2 emissions like oil or like gas or like coal?
Actually, in our survey, we ask several questions asking, favorability, whether they favor coal-fired power plants. And I'm not sure if which question we would ask for coal-fired power plants with high CO2 emission, but we found that in both countries that coal-fired power plants are less favored and very close to nuclear power plants.
Thank you. I see we have 5 minutes left. So if you have some more questions for the panel you would want to raise, please do so in the chat. On my side, I have a question I wanted to ask to Francois at the beginning on what he showed on the Belgium case. If there are some lessons that could be learned for France, things to be done or things not to be done. Francois, I don't know if you are still there. Yes.
Yes, I am. Thanks for your question, Bertrand. So, well, if I have to think about it, I mean, of course, France is a bit different from Belgium in many respects. I mean, as I mentioned, electricity from nuclear in Belgium is about 50%. We have seen from different speakers that it's even more in the case of France. The country is also way bigger, so we cannot rely on import like Belgium could. But if I would have to think of one thing, at least, is really the planning. Yeah? So nuclear is represent a lot of electricity. We are talking of terawatt hours and a lot of terawatt hours. This cannot be replaced easily. So it takes quite some significant investment in any type of alternative. And those replacement also take time. And we should not only think of the technical time to replace and build, because we know how much time it takes to build some plant, but you also have to think upfront of all the, of course, you can think of permitting, but let's say the legal process, the economic process before the market, the expectation of players, and also take into consideration all legislation at European level, all the rules. And we see in the case of nuclear in Belgium that the decarbonization ambition also have an importance, and people are uncomfortable in building a fossil fuel asset today. So it's quite a lot of element to consider, and people should not expect that because you close nuclear, something will just happen by magic and replace it.
Okay, thank you. So timing, basically. Maybe another add-on question for Guillaume or Yves. You showed, and both of you showed about the importance of the French nuclear system for France, but more generally to Europe. In a way, is the market design today with the role, as you stressed, Guillaume, the role played by the wholesale market, and the fact that there are mechanisms around that, and the wholesale market may not fully cover the costs? Isn't it an issue with the overall market design? Do you think it's functioning well, the interaction of the French market design and the European market design on that part? Maybe Guillaume and then Yves on that.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. I would not be able to answer this question. The only, just to maybe two remarks. The first one is that if I understand, I think nuclear and the wholesale markets, either the energy markets or the capacity markets, is a question very difficult to tackle. And if I understood correctly, the worst situation for a nuclear producer is when the prices are low but are above its marginal cost. And in a way, we have to find a situation in which the nuclear will never be marginal, because otherwise there will be a huge missing money problem, and the wholesale markets will not deliver maybe the right signal. And that's my second question, and maybe it's more a remark, and I raise it for Yves. Maybe I don't really understand how the wholesale markets will still be helpful in a world where we will have a lot of low carbon technology, because they all have the same cost structure with very competitive marginal cost, almost zero for certain technology, and very high fixed cost. And therefore, I'm trying to understand how the whole thing will work in the future.
That's a really challenging question, and effectively, the evolution of the market design is a question, especially with regard to how to remunerate flexibility with a higher variable renewable penetration and flexible sources as well that would be low carbon by 2050. So we're not pricing the carbon price as per thermal assets. Now, with regard to the current market design evolution, one of the key changes over the last couple of years, and which has been introduced by Francois as well, is the implementation of the CRM, which effectively would provide additional remuneration designed to be, and the Belgian CRM is a bit of a specific design, but the French one has other specificities, and well, basically all of the European capacity markets which have been developed in the recent years all have different specificities, whereas it's Italy, Poland, the UK, or Ireland, for instance. But they are all basically designed to make sure that the current flexibility providers, and so that's mainly the CCGTs or used to be the coal plants as well, recover what we call the missing money. So basically that they can make sure that their investment is economically viable, whether it's an existing investment, and so that's mainly recovering all of the fixed costs. And so they could include, depending on the market competitiveness or market pressure, they could include a bit of a capex annuity to amortize the initial investment, or mainly recover the fixed cost. Or if it's for new investments, so that's effectively securing long-term contracts, which would allow the developer to effectively recover the initial investments as well. So basically what we see, and that's kind of already what's happening, is that there are three different ways, current parallel ways of remunerating energy investment at the moment. So you've got effectively the wholesale market that remunerates the short-term dispatch and short-term variable costs. You've got the capacity markets that remunerate the flexibility or reliability. And you've got all of the CFD type of contracts as well for renewable energy, which basically makes sure that you remain on track for developing and accelerating the development of viable renewable energy and low carbon energies. So now the key question for at the EU level and at the national level as well is how to make sure that these different mechanisms communicate or are combined together. So for instance, for the ARENH, so we know that the ARENH was designed before the introduction of the capacity market, but has been modified somehow so that the ARENH already include the capacity market value. And so already kind of capture both the wholesale revenues and the capacity market values. So now the question is whether end suppliers that secure ARENH supply would pay the additional taxes to remunerate additional green investment. But I guess that's a question for Guillaume or a question for a different discussion.
Okay, thank you. I think we are running out of time. Just maybe a conclusion word. I would thank you all for this very interesting discussion. And maybe a key insight I got, we see that all these mechanisms are extremely complicated. We have to interact between competition, also make sure that investment are there on time. I see that in Belgium, it took almost 20 years for 6 giga, and we are not completely yet there at 4 years from the deadline. So in Europe, we have, let's say, 30 years to make it work for how many? You say 110, so it's 20 times the quantities in Belgium, and we do not. It's without capacity that will not be CO2 emitting. So the challenge is really huge, and what is sure is that there will be many debates to make sure to find an infrastructure that can work and to deliver it on time. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for your participation. If I may just remind the speakers to upload the slide on the conference platform, please, if you didn't do it already. And thank you once again for all your very interesting presentations.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.